My name is Heather Wokush, and welcome to another segment of Witnessing History. Today it is a great pleasure to be here with Gloria Messer. Thank you very much for joining us, Gloria.
Thank you.
Yeah. You were born in 1938. So
don't tell anyone.
Yeah, okay. Now, how were your parents immigrants?
Yes, both of my parents were born in Warsaw, Poland.
Mm-hmm.
My mother came here when she was 14. My father came when he was 35.
And why did they come?
My mother's family, I assume, came because they were persecuted after the First World War. They came before the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember my grandfather had come here and had to work to get money to bring her over.
Mm-hmm.
And she had 4 children. She had 2 girls and 2 boys.
And I'm sorry, they were persecuted because?
They were Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And I only realize this in retrospect. They were not very social or very outgoing, and only when I was much older did I realize it probably was because they had to keep to themselves. They could not be with everyone. They were close to their family, but you know, they never invited people into the house.
And they being who?
My parents.
Okay.
And when I was young, I wanted to bring all my friends home, and they wouldn't let me, and I was really, really upset about that. And therefore, today, anyone can come into my house.
But so 1938, so your parents, you have a Jewish family, and your parents had been persecuted in Warsaw.
That's something I'm surmising.
Okay.
I don't know, because my parents were not religious. So I don't have a religious upbringing. I mean, I'm proud of being Jewish. But when I was little, I remember I screaming I wanted to try lobster and pizza and all these things, and they didn't know what it was. So I used to fight a lot.
And you are from New York, born and raised New York.
I was born and raised in the Bronx, and I left when I was 19. So I've been living in Manhattan most of my life.
Okay. Now the whole concept of World War II, I mean, you were 7 years old when it ended, or something. So do you remember anything at all about those times?
Yes, I remember when the war was over. I remember we had a big block party, and it was a lot of fun. As a matter of fact, they had the streets roped off, and I was playing with the other kids, and I was running on the streets, and I ran into a rope, and I got knocked out.
Oh!
I remember that. And it was a very happy time, very celebratory.
Did you have any idea what was being fought and why? I mean, you were just a little kid at the time.
I knew that it had something to do with being Jewish because all the neighbors, everybody had family, and everybody was worried about their family. They were all talking about them being over on the other side during the war. They didn't know whether they were alive or not.
And the other side meaning Europe?
Meaning Germany, Poland, or wherever else it was. And my mother's 2 brothers were in the Army. So
in the U.S. Army? In
the U.S. Army.
Okay. And during this time, did you hear of people, for example, people returning to the community who had fought, or people immigrating because of persecution within your community? Was there much movement?
Well, I think a lot of the neighbors and the people in the vicinity, my parents came before the Second World War, but a lot of people in the area had come because of the war. So they had escaped, and that's why they were always concerned about their people. And they used to talk about, like, the Greener are coming. Greener would be green in Yiddish. And I understood a little of the Yiddish, so I thought Greener were green people. And when the first person came from, it was a cousin, I said, "But you're not green."
Why did they use that term to refer to these people?
I think it related to the word greenhorn, and I don't really remember what it meant, but a greenhorn.
So somebody who's new to the country, perhaps, or something.
Perhaps. I'm not really sure what it meant.
And what was, do you remember meeting some of these people who had come in, and what was that like?
I remember when the people came, they all had these little blue numbers on their hands. And I remember looking at that and, you know, going, oh, and hearing all these stories about all these people who lost families. Everyone had horror stories. And we had one relative, a second cousin, who had told us he had a large family, I think in Poland, and he told us that they were all shot in front of his eyes. He was standing there and they shot all of them, they threw them right into the trenches.
Because they were Jewish. So as a child, how could you process this kind of information?
As a child, I guess I knew there were people that didn't like us, okay? And as a matter of fact, I remember as a child, I remember the first black child coming to public school. So I guess that must have been like 8 or 9. And I took, her name was Elaine, I took her home to my parents, and my parents were pretty okay, but they, you know, it was strange for them. And then she took me to her parents, and I remember her grandmother was sitting at the table and looking at me as if I were an alien, like, where was I from? So I understood that it was the same for both families. They just had different cultures at that point. And, you know, that was very interesting, but I always liked anyone that was different.
So you've certainly seen so many interesting changes in New York from the time that you've been there, and then you just referred now to, you know, racial integration or lack of integration and all of that. How about when the Puerto Rican community started to grow here in New York? When was that, and what do you remember of that?
I left the place I live with when I was about 14. So 38, 48, so it was about 52. And I remember when the buildings across the street, all of a sudden they brought all the Puerto Rican immigrants in. And I was fascinated because we were not allowed to have Christmas trees. So my sisters and I used to count all the Christmas lights in their houses.
In the houses of the Puerto Rican people living across the street?
They were all like 5-story buildings. And after Christmas, we went and we took branches and we brought them home and we started decorating them. And my father came home and started screaming. But in retrospect, what I realize now is all these people were being brought in at that time to work in the garment center. So they were really being brought in to be exploited, but I didn't know it then. They were just different, so I was intrigued. And I'm sort of attracted to darker people, so I thought they were very attractive. And then also, I remember, and that was, I lived there until I was 14, then the black population started coming in. So the Puerto Ricans, then the blacks. And, you know, there were different waves, just different things. And I remember the 50s, I think, for me, seemed to be very depressing.
Very depressing.
Don't know why. I think it must have been, well, it was after the war. I used to go out and visit friends and come back late at night. And one night I remember coming home alone and seeing a whole crowd of people, and there was a doorway. I was frightened because they were like screaming. So I crawled into the doorway and stayed there until they disappeared. But I still don't really understand what was happening.
So your community was changing. Basically, the war had ended, the demographics were changing, some people were being brought in possibly for somewhat slave labor to work in factories, and this period of rapid change. Did you feel it?
I imagine that it must have been exactly the way it is today in the United States.
Okay.
In other words, it was probably the economic situation must have been like it is now.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was very young, someone saying to the children, you don't have to be competitive. And today, everybody is competitive. And I see signs on the subway stops, on the telephone booths, be competitive, be competitive. And here I was a little child, and it stuck with me all those years.
Signs that said you don't have to be competitive?
Today.
Oh.
But back then, it stayed in my mind that someone said you don't have to be competitive. And I didn't know why. I didn't understand what competitive was, I guess. I was very young at the time. And I suspect that we are going through the same situation because economically our situation today is the same as it was then.
That's a good point. Yeah, when you have a big economic downturn and then all of these elements of, one could even say, fascism arise, and many people have drawn parallels between, fascist entities in the past and what's going on here. But what's interesting, as you said, is that in your time there was this message that you got, at least, of we can work together and you don't have to compete, whereas that message is not available now. And it's more like you're on your own.
It's just the opposite. But also, we are coming out of like a time which was similar to the 20s, I guess, which the 20s were before the Second World War. And I think they went through a war, and after the war, I imagine a lot of the money must have been, again I'm surmising, made the same way it's being made today, and they couldn't do it anymore. And we ended up coming out of the Depression, really. But I just seem to remember the Depression areas.
And then you had this kind of dark feeling in the 50s, and then came the 60s. What was the 60s like in New York?
Like I didn't belong.
Because? Why?
Well, first of all, I always dressed and like a black skirt and a white blouse and high heels.
You still do?
I still do. And everybody was wearing like jeans. I didn't get jeans until many, many years later. And everyone had long hair and very informal. And everybody was smoking grass, which I didn't do. And I lived off 2nd Avenue in the 50s, which I still live there. And I used to watch the protests march down 2nd Avenue towards the UN.
Can you tell us more about this? What the protesters?
A protest against the war, the Vietnam War.
Okay. And how often did they march?
It seems like it was constant.
As in every week? It
seems constant.
Okay.
Yes.
And you were possibly a bit more conservative than that.
I was more conservative.
Okay.
Basically, at that time, I was against war, but I didn't have any feelings about going against authority. And they were going against authority.
And you were in that age group, though. You were in your 20s.
I was a little bit older than most of the people because these were the people that were born after the war. So they're like 7 years younger than I was.
So you saw these hippie types, possibly
Right.
dressed not in pearls,
Right.
marching towards the UN. And what was your idea about these people?
Well, at that time I thought, well, they're smoking grass. They don't know what they're doing. They're marching. I felt that they were being led, which is happening today, too. I feel that a lot of the younger people, they're following propaganda.
Looking back now at what was going on in the 60s, do you think that they were being led?
Yes.
In New York, do you think there was...
Yes, because the people who were running the marches and the protests were not people that you would really admire. They wanted to be personally important. And they were using the war to make themselves popular and make themselves leaders. But they weren't doing anything for the people that were marching. and there weren't many jobs. I worked. I mean, I always worked, and I had interesting jobs, but it was very difficult to get work for a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
And everything was free. I remember we had Lindsay as the mayor, and they started making things free, like the parks were free, there was entertainment, and the reason being, no one could get jobs. The young population were all over the place,
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't know what to do with them. So
In the
they
1960s.
they had to keep them busy or entertained because they were protesting.
Mm-hmm.
And like we have OWS here.
This is what I was thinking. It brings up shades of Occupy now.
Right.
Right.
And we got out people in black uniforms and machine guns
Mm-hmm.
against the protest. And I find it pretty scary
Mm-hmm.
because I don't recollect that happening in the 60s.
Oh, that's interesting. So basically, instead of opening up the parks, now they're bringing out the militia
Right.
to deal with that. Which is
They
kind of-
opened the parks, they had free concerts,
Mhm.
they had a lot of things that were free then.
Mhm.
And it was like sort of wonderful.
Well, what are some other transitions that you have seen in New York? I mean, there's so many things that happen, but like between the 1960s and now, I mean, clearly we've got 9/11 in there, but what are some other interesting historical things that you would notice?
Well, when I moved to where I live now, there were all brownstones on the blocks. There were no tall buildings, and you could see this. You could see the sky, and you could see the sun on the streets. And now, every time you walk outside, there are 12 new skyscrapers,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember part of that depressing 50s era. There's a transition from that to this, but I don't feel that the transition we have now is necessarily the best transition
Mm-hmm.
for the people.
Mm-hmm. And what transition do you think is going on now?
At that time, there was a protest against the tall buildings because they were taking the air away from the other people. The buildings on Park Avenue were all built as co-ops. This is before the war, as part of this rising, wealthy generation, the golden 20s. And all the buildings went bankrupt. They all became rentals.
Oh.
In the 70s and 80s, they started co-oping them again.
Mm-hmm.
And I strongly suspect that they're also going to become rentals again because of the economic situation, that they're going to fail.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we are repeating history exactly as it was repeated.
Yeah, well, it's interesting parallels, certainly. And one I would add to that also is, NYU is now trying to gobble up, a lot of Greenwich Village and other parts of that which go along into people losing their parks and losing their air and all of that. So what I'm hearing from you is a kind of theme of history is repeating itself, but maybe in a way that's more aggressive than it was before, less community-oriented, more individualistic? Is that what you're saying?
Actually, I suspect that it must have been just the same way in Germany before the Second World War as it is today in the United States.
In what ways?
I'm afraid of the economic situation. I'm afraid of what the banks are doing. I'm afraid that greed and selfishness seems to be accepted.
Mm-hmm. It's glorified.
It's glorified, and competitiveness is glorified, and it doesn't have to be that way. And I know when I left school, I got my own apartment. I shared it, of course, but there are a lot of things I couldn't afford, but I pretty much did what I wanted. I was free. I don't feel these people are free now. The rents are too expensive. They can't afford to live in Manhattan anymore. And I mentioned I have a surrogate daughter, Elizabeth, and she came from France when she was 5 years old. And I remember when she graduated from college, she had a lot of friends who got all apartments on the west side, which was the in place. The in place was the east side when I was growing up, the 60s. That's where I moved to. But these kids all moved to the west side, but they all came from very wealthy families. Even so, they had very nice apartments, but there were about 6 of them in an apartment. There were 2 of us in an apartment when I was growing up, when I took my first apartment. But these were 6 girls in apartments, and these are people who could afford it. And I am sure there were a lot of people who had apartments, larger apartments as well. And also everybody was very tall.
But I guess, if they could afford it, a lot of people can't afford it, and they can't find work. And so to return to the whole idea of history repeating itself and possibly, so what I'm hearing is that you're feeling frightened. You used that word a couple of times.
I'm frightened about what is going to happen, because I saw what happened with after the Second World War, and now I'm seeing what probably preceded it.
What do you think should be done in order to rectify the situation?
I think equality is very important, racism, and I don't think that any human being is worth millions of dollars. Second of all, most of these CEOs, all they do is go to lunch and talk to people. And all the people running corporations, they're only interested in sales and marketing. We don't make anything in this country anymore. I like doing things with my hands. That's why I like fooling around with video, because I always sat behind a desk. But that's not admired anymore. It's, if you go for a job, they want to know how much money can you make. I remember years ago, when I was looking for a job, I was asked, what was the most exciting thing you ever did, or you ever accomplished? And at that time, I had written the regulations to import endangered wild animals, because that was stymied here. And I realized I was applying for a real estate job. And I realized that they wanted me to say that I made $1 million. And that was not what I'd be most impressed with. But that's the only thing they're impressed with, is how much money can you make.
Do you think that the inherent value system of society was stronger in 1938 when you were born?
Absolutely.
So what do you think has changed, and why?
I think we lost our way. I think I was brought up, you have to tell the truth, you have to be honest. I was very shy, nobody believes me. And today, everybody, they lie. I mean, like people who can't do something will tell you how great they are and how much they know. Meanwhile, they don't know anything. And I find that very, very strange. It must be hard to live with, making things up. And you must be insecure if you're saying, I can do this or I've done that, and you're not telling the truth.
Well, so this idea of needing to put a spotlight on things and to tell the truth, is that part of your value system, one of the reasons that later on in life you've gotten so heavily involved in being a television producer and director and doing segments? Is there any connection there? I
always had great jobs. I always had a lot of fun at what I was working with, and I was working with Warner Leroy, who was a very wealthy man. He was one of the first Warner Brother grandchildren. And at that particular time, we were I always worked on jobs that were temporary. We were building something, we'd finish, we'd go on to something else. We were going on to something else, and one had said to me, well, I would like you to be in charge of this. And I said to him, fine, then I want the same amounts of money the guy who's running the department makes. And he said, I can't do that. And I said, why not? And he said, because you make more than any woman in the company. And I said, well, what has that got to do with it? Besides, I hired the guy.
Oh.
He reports to me.
Okay.
So I can't make as much money as he's making. Didn't make sense. So I decided I was going to leave. And that was when women were, women's rights.
And what year was this?
It was, I guess in the 70s,
Okay, so
maybe 80s. And I decided to go find another job, to find something else to do. But I loved what I was doing. I loved the people I was working with. And I found another job, and I was looking to do something where I wasn't sitting behind a desk, where I wasn't, I was used to running things and stuff like that. I was a frustrated artist.
And then you certainly found the perfect thing in terms of being a very successful and productive and wonderful television producer and director. And we have exactly less than a minute left. And so what I would like to ask you is, just in closing, if you have one sentence or one idea that you would like to share with young people everywhere, what would that be?
It would be to really believe in themselves and to treat other people the way you would like to be treated, and to stop trying to compete. It's really an ugly thing. Competition is really ugly, and we can't all be good at everything. So concentrate on what you're good at and do it.
Okay.
And don't try to compete or get someone else's job or do something as good as someone else. You don't have to.
And on that note, we thank you very much, Gloria Messer, for having joined us today. And we thank you for having joined us as well.